The book of Psalms is the largest book of the Bible, and it's really a collection of many different compositions that were written by probably many different authors over the course of many centuries. But what makes the book of Psalms different, distinctive, from at least most of the books that we've been reading so far, except for the book of Job maybe, is that it's written in poetry instead of prose. Most of the books in the Old Testament are written in simple prose, like, most of the Pentateuch, I guess. Although there are poetic sections within the Pentateuch, it's by and large written in prose. And the same thing is true for most of the other books. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and so on. Those books are written in mostly some kind of prose narrative. So the authors create kind of a storyline and a chronology, a sequence of events that the reader is able to follow. Other books of the Old Testament, like the prophets, are also written in prose, although again they have certain poetic elements to them. Most of what they write has a certain kind of logic to it, and it follows the rules of grammar, and the authors try to present their ideas in ways that are organized and relatively easy to follow. Well, and this raises kind of an important issue. What is the difference between prose and poetry? I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but it's really not so straightforward. Prose follows certain rules of grammar and sentence structure. It usually tries to present ideas in ways that are more organized or logical. Poetry isn't quite as bound to those rules as prose is. It tends to be more characterized by its rhythm and meter, and for its breaking of grammatical rules. It also makes greater use of artistic devices, it's more emotive, and it encourages deeper contemplation. So here's an example of a poetic composition. It's from one of my favorite songwriters, David Gray. It says, "I am the bottom line of the joke. I am ecstasy spilling like bright egg yolk. I am the thoughts you're too ashamed to ever share, and I'm the smell of it you're trying to wash out of your hair." Now, we recognize this as poetry because it's kind of ambiguous as to what he's talking about, right? He's being very subtle. And so he's inviting you to contemplate further what's being said. We've also got some poetic structures like the I am repeating in several of the lines. We've got the rhymes with joke and egg yolk, and with share and hair. And so there are lots of things that help us to recognize that this is poetry and not simple prose. All right, and here's a famous psalm, Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." We recognize this as poetry because it's using all these metaphors, the metaphor of the shepherd and the sheep. This kind of imagery would have probably resonated quite well with many of the readers of the Psalms because they were shepherds themselves. And so lots of them would have understood the importance of water and green pastures and the danger of certain walkways, and so on. Now, one thing about the Psalms, and the reason so many people like to read the Psalms, is because they're oftentimes very generic, and you can apply some of the metaphors or some of the words that are being said to your own life. You can probably do that with this psalm, for example. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," right? We've all been through difficult situations and thought maybe that we were going to die or something, and we trusted in God and he brought us through, right? So this psalm would resonate with you if you had some kind of experience like that. Now, poetry is one of the most ancient writing styles. It's even more ancient than prose narrative. That may sound a bit surprising to you, but that's because you were brought up speaking and writing in prose. You probably grew up listening to music as well, and so you would have been exposed to a good bit of poetry, but you weren't really taught to speak or write poetically. And so you and I tend to think of poetry as a more sophisticated way of communicating. But it doesn't have to be. As I said, poetry doesn't have to follow the normal rules of grammar, and it doesn't require the writer to lay out his or her thoughts in some kind of nicely organized or logical way. So in those respects, it can actually be easier to write in poetry than prose. In any case, that's what we get in the ancient world, lots of poetry. Even when people wanted to tell stories, they wrote in poetry. We call these stories epics. All right, well, let's talk specifically about the Psalms. What are some of the poetic features or characteristics of the Psalms that we find in the Bible? The Psalms make use of several different poetic devices. As with other forms of poetry, the psalmists employ similes, metaphors and imagery, assonance, alliterations, and rhymes. Hebrew poetry doesn't really use rhymes so much, although rhymes do occur. It's probably more happenstance and coincidence than anything else. The Psalms also tug at the emotions in ways that are quite different from what we find in prose. This is from Psalm 44. You have made us the taunt of our neighbors, the derision and scorn of those around us. You have made us a byword among the nations, a laughingstock among the peoples. All day long my disgrace is before me, and shame has covered my face. At the sound of the taunter and reviler, at the sight of the enemy and the avenger. All this has come upon us, though we have not forgotten you, and we have not been false to your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps departed from your way. Yet you have broken us in the place of jackals and covered us with the shadow of death. If we had forgotten the name of our God, or spread out our hands to a foreign god, would not God discover this? For he knows the secrets of the heart. Yet for your sake we are killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Awake, why are you sleeping, O Lord? Rouse yourself, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust, our belly clings to the ground. Rise up, come to our help, redeem us for the sake of your steadfast love. So this is kind of the opposite of Psalm 23. The psalmist is perplexed as to why God has allowed so much chaos and devastation. And so he registers his complaints and makes an impassioned plea for God to rise up and come to his aid. Note again some of the imagery. They are living in the shadow of death. They are being killed all day long like sheep going to the slaughter. Like sheep going to the slaughter. When imagery is introduced with words such as like or as, we refer to this as a simile. Think of it as an author making an explicit use of metaphor. Metaphorical language isn't always explicit, and so sometimes people dispute as to whether it's even a metaphor. Think, for example, of when Christ distributed bread to his disciples and said, "This is my body." Was he speaking metaphorically there? Well, I think he was, but many have interpreted him quite literally. If Christ had invoked a simile and said, "This is like my body," nobody would have misunderstood him because the language would have been explicitly metaphorical. Okay, and then Psalm 69, deliver me out of the mire and let me not sink. Here it's not a simile, it's just a metaphor. And so you got to kind of figure out, well, what is he talking about here? What is the mire? And what does it mean not to sink? Well, mire, it's probably some like difficult or maybe dangerous situation. And then sinking into that mire further would be getting into a more difficult or a more dangerous situation. Here's something from a popular song that most of you will probably recognize. Just like the white-winged dove sings the song, sounds like she's singing. This is what's known as alliteration, because you've got the repetition of the S sound on the front of all these words. Sings the song, sounds like she's singing. Now, alliteration is different from assonance. We'll talk about assonance in just a moment here with We Three Kings. But notice, actually, the title itself is assonance, right? We Three Kings, E-E-E. Okay, assonance deals more with vowels, and alliteration deals more with consonants, and consonants usually at the beginning of the words. The vowels, usually, they don't necessarily have to come first, I suppose they can, but a lot of times they don't. So we've got this Christmas carol. We three kings of Orient are bearing gifts, we traverse afar, field and fountain, moor and mountain, following yonder star. Now here we've got lots of different things going on. We got rhymes, afar and star. Then we've got alliteration with field and fountain, moor and mountain. And then we've also got assonance with following yonder star. Ah, 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 ah. All right, and then we've got parallelism. Parallelism has been defined as the correspondence of one verse or line with another. And this is probably one of the most characteristic features of Hebrew poetry, at least on a structural level. Now, I'm sure it's not totally distinctive of Hebrew poetry. I'm sure it's lots of ancient Near Eastern compositions would have followed this same structure. But if we want to distinguish Hebrew poetry from, say, Greek poetry or modern poetry, this is kind of something that stands out. And there are three kinds of parallelism: synonymous, antithetic, and synthetic. Synonymous and antithetic are the easiest to understand. So let's start with synonymous. We've got Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and all those who live in it. You can see how the second line basically repeats what's being said in the first. Now, some people would say that it's not just repeating it, it's nuancing it a bit, because the earth and the world are kind of two different things. The earth is like the whole created order, and then the world is more like where people live, the civilized part of the earth, if you will. But in any case, you've got similar ideas going on in both of these, and so we call this synonymous parallelism. And the structure comes out a bit more clearly in Hebrew because you can see, aside from that first preposition and word, you've got to the Lord or of the Lord, and then the earth and her fullness, and then the world and those living in her. All right, and then Psalm 30. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. You have turned my mourning is paralleled by you have taken off my sackcloth. Sackcloth was it was a type of garment that people would wear when they were in mourning. They were sad about something. And it was a rough outfit, oftentimes black, dark, or always dark or black or something, to kind of symbolize the dark feelings that were being felt. Okay, God has taken that sackcloth off the person and clothed him with joy. And that corresponds with the dancing in the first line. All right, and then we've got antithetic parallelism, which is the opposite of what we just saw. So instead of saying the same thing in the second line, we're saying the opposite. Oh, let the evil of the wicked come to an end, but establish the righteous. Okay, don't let the righteous come to an end, but establish them. Let them remain. And then Psalm 18, for you deliver a humble people, but the haughty eyes you bring down. Okay, haughty just means like arrogant. So those two structures are pretty easy to identify. A little bit more difficult in my mind, at least, is the synthetic parallelism. And what we have here is the two lines, they play against one another, or they play on each other in order to explicate or clarify whatever idea is being communicated. Okay, so synonymous and antithetic parallelisms are pretty easy to understand. Hopefully you won't have difficulty with those. Synthetic parallelism is a bit more tricky. And I don't even know if I fully understand how to identify these. Sometimes I just say to myself, all right, well, clearly this is not synonymous and it's not antithetic, so I'll just say that it's synthetic. But the idea, I guess, is that you've got one line saying one thing and then another line sort of expanding upon or elaborating on the other line. So let's look at a few of these. We got Psalm 66, come and see what God has done. And then, he is awesome in his deeds among mortals. So that second line kind of expounds what was hinted at in the first line. And then Psalm 113, from the rising of the sun to its setting, what's happening? The name of the Lord is to be praised. Okay, so again, the second line is kind of expounding upon the idea that was introduced in the first. Okay, and then Psalm 37:14, the wicked draw the sword and bend their bows. The next lines are actually written in synonymous parallelism. So we've got to bring down the poor and the needy, to kill those who walk uprightly. That's what the wicked are doing. They're killing the righteous. So the second two lines are basically elaborating on the first line. Well, and then we've got another poetic device, these word pairs. This is similar to the parallelism stuff, but now it's not about relating entire lines to one another, but individual words and phrases. And so you'll often see certain words and phrases being used in pairs with one another. So in the first one, well, the first two lines, we've got hear and give ear, right? Give ear is a verb, just like hear is a verb. It's not two words as in English, but it's a Hebrew word that we translate that way. So these two verbs, they're obviously synonyms in some ways, and so they use them in pairs like this. Okay, and then peoples and inhabitants, those are just basically synonyms, so they're grouped together. But then in the next two lines, it gets a little bit more complex because we've got low and high and rich and poor being paired together. So it's opposite things being paired with two other opposite things. And then in the last, the third line, we've got my mouth and my heart being paired together, and wisdom and understanding. And then in Psalm 92, we've got give thanks and sing praises, the Lord and your name, steadfast love and faithfulness, morning and night, music, melody, lute, harp, lyre, all these things being paired together. All right, and then we've got this structure called chiasmus, or chiasm. This is where the structure kind of flips, it inverts. And so we've got in Psalm 1:6, for the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Now this comes through more obviously in Hebrew. So if you see here in the Hebrew, the word yodea is the verb. So he knows, and then the subject, the Lord, comes after that. That's usually the way Hebrew is written. The subject comes after the verb. Unlike us in English, we put the verb after the subject. But in Hebrew, it's the opposite. Now, it doesn't have to come before the subject. And we can see that here in this line because the verb comes at the very end. And then in between those two verbs, we've got derech tzedakim, which is the way of the righteous. And then vederech, again, same word, reshaim, which is the word for wicked. So the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked. Okay, so we've got the structure here of A, B, B prime, A prime. So the structure basically reverses itself. Okay, and the same thing happens in Psalm 18. In my distress, I called upon the Lord, to my God. Okay, that corresponds to the Lord, my God. I cried for help. Okay, so the verb here, called, comes before the Lord, and then in the second line, it comes after my God. And then Psalm 145, every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. So it's just same structure, A, B, B prime, A prime. Now chiasms can be written in a much more complex way. Some people would claim that the book of Job is written as one giant chiasm. Other people have argued that the Josephus's Jewish War, which is this really big book, was also written as a chiasm. Now, I think sometimes commentators go a little bit crazy on this stuff. They start to see things that aren't actually there. Kind of like, when you stare up into the clouds, you start to see images and things. Well, maybe the same way with some of this chiasm stuff. I'm kind of a chiasm minimalist, if you will. If it's very obvious, then I'll acknowledge that it exists. If you have to really kind of squint your eyes and try to see it, because it's something that's much more subtle and complex. And so you have to associate this one seemingly random word with another seemingly random word in the other part of the book, and then two other seemingly random words that aren't even in close proximity to the first two. Well, in that case, I tend to be very skeptical. I think you need to kind of watch out for that. People sometimes go on these wild goose chases trying to find chiasms in books when there's no chiasm to be found. And then kind of a similar thing, maybe the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. I don't know if you've heard about this before, but it's also known as the frequency illusion. This is when people become conscious of something. They learn about some new thing, and then they suddenly start to notice it more and more, giving them the impression that it's actually happening with greater frequency than before. I've had this happen in my own life. I used to not be bothered by ticking clocks, but one day I started to notice this ticking, tick, 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 tick. And now it's like whenever I enter a room and I hear a ticking clock, it stands out and it bothers me. Or another thing, in the book of Revelation, it talks about the number of the beast is 666. And then there's also a variant there that is not 666, but 616. Well, when I look at the clock, a lot of times I'll see 616, right? If I go on the elliptical, I'll see 616 or I'll see 666. And it just seems like I'm always seeing these numbers now. But it's not because they're happening more often. It's just I'm more attuned to noticing those things. And so I think we can do the same thing with these chiasms. We start to see things that don't actually exist, or we start to see patterns that don't actually exist. Coincidences do happen. I think that's an important exegetical principle to keep in mind. All right, another type of structure is known as the inclusio. We can see here in Psalm chapter 8 that the psalm opens and closes with, "O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth." So it starts off with that and it ends. It creates this inclusio, right? Think of an inclusio as bookends. Bookends are those things that you put on the sides of a row of books that are sitting on the top of your shelf to keep them standing upright. Now, the book of Psalms is written in 5 books. Book 1 extends from chapter 1 to chapter 41. And so chapter 1 opens with this word Ashrei, which means happy or blessed. And then in Psalm 41, the close of book 1, we have the same word showing up at the beginning of that chapter. So some people would say that that's an inclusio. All right, another structure is known as an acrostic. We can see this very clearly in Psalm chapter 111, where in Hebrew, every verse begins with the next letter of the alphabet. And Psalm 119 does something similar. You can see in verses 81 through 88, all the first words begin with Kaf, the letter Kaf. In verses 89 through 96, they all begin with the letter Lamed. And in verses 97 through 104, they all begin with Mem. Okay, now let's talk about the forms of the Psalms. Now, what is a form? A form is kind of like the ideal structure of something. Plato talked about the world of forms, or the world of ideas. So if you think about a chair, what is it that makes a chair a chair? Why do we call it a chair and not a couch? Well, it seems to have certain features. It's got like a back, it's got legs, it's got armrests, and a seat to sit on. But then some chairs don't have legs. Some don't have armrests. Some of them don't even have a backrest. So Plato toyed around with this idea, and he came up with this teaching that there is a world of abstract ideas that exists. And because we are somehow connected with this world of ideas through the intellect, we're able to recognize when we see a chair and distinguish it from a couch. You see, because if you know what the ideal form of the chair is, then you're going to be able to recognize a chair when you see it. And you're going to be able to distinguish it from, say, a couch or a table. And that's kind of what's going on with form criticism. Scholars come up with what they consider to be the ideal form of a psalm. And once they've done this, they can classify the psalm and supposedly get better insights into what the psalmist was trying to say, what was motivating him to write, and perhaps even when he was writing. So form criticism is ultimately a hermeneutical strategy. In other words, it's a way to aid us in our interpretation of the Psalms, or whatever other literary composition we're trying to interpret. Form criticism attempts to identify and then classify the various forms or types of literature found in the biblical text in order to help place the texts within the lives of the people who preserved and handed them on, and in order to aid in interpreting the texts. Now, the German term for form is Gattung, and the plural is Gattungen, so sometimes you'll see those terms being thrown around. People will often use German terms in biblical studies because the Germans were very much at the forefront of many of these critical approaches to the study of the Bible. Okay, so I'll mention several of these forms. We've got first the hymns, and we'll start with hymns of the community. These were songs that were sung during worship on holy days. Psalm 105 is a good example of that. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of his wondrous works. He is the Lord our God, his judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant forever, the word that he commanded for 1,000 generations, the covenant that he made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, and to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. So you can imagine the congregation of Israel sort of reciting this psalm, and it would be a song of praise to Yahweh, and also a way of inculcating the notion that Israel had a special place in God's redemptive plan. Okay, so those hymns would be sung by more than just one person. Maybe it was all the singers in the temple, or maybe it was a congregation of just lay people who had memorized the psalm or whatever. But then there were other hymns that were written from a more individualistic point of view. These hymns were also addressed to God in the worship of ancient Israel, but in these we just have a single voice that's present, and it's the individual that is praising God for his goodness, or on behalf of that individual, usually for a deliverance from some trying situation. And here's an example of that, chapter 30, verses 1 through 3. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up, and have not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried out to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol. You restored me to life from among those who go down to the pit. All right, now whether we're dealing with community or individual hymns of thanksgiving, there are usually certain elements or features that help us to identify this form. The Psalms will usually start out with an introduction in which the psalmist declares the intention of giving thanks and praising God. It will usually also contain some kind of narrative in which the psalmist tells what has happened that has prompted his words of praise. And then lastly, these hymns will have a conclusion in which the psalmist praises God for all that he has done on the psalmist's behalf. And here's an example of that in Psalm chapter 33. You can see the introduction in verses 1 through 3, and then the narrative, if you want to call it that, in verses 4 through 19. And then lastly, the conclusion in verses 20 through 22. Another form is the lamentation psalm. As with the hymns, laments can be either written from the perspective of a larger community or from the perspective of an individual. So the community laments were sung by the assembled people, protesting and grieving the tragedies and injustice in and the threats to their communities. We can see this in Psalm chapter 12. Save, O Lord, for the godly one is gone, for the faithful have vanished from among the children of men. Everyone utters lies to his neighbor. With flattering lips and a double heart they speak. May the Lord cut off all the flattering lips, the tongues that make great boasts. The words of the Lord are pure words, like silver refined in a furnace on the ground, purified 7 times. You, O Lord, will keep them. You will guard us from this generation forever. Okay, and then we've also got individual laments. Individual laments were sung by a single person, but like the community laments, these appealed to God for deliverance from a threatening situation. Psalm chapter 6, O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. Turn, O Lord, deliver my life. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows weak because of my foes. Depart from me, all you workers of evil. For the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled. They shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment. So again, the only difference here is that this lament is written from the standpoint of the individual instead of the community. All right, and then we've got some minor types or forms of these psalms. In addition to the four main types that we've been talking about, the hymns, the community hymns and the individual hymns, and the laments of the community and the individual, there are also many psalms that can be distinguished and categorized largely by the subject matter. Yeah, so it's not so much the form, but rather the subject matter, the topics that are being covered. That's how we categorize these psalms. So we've got royal psalms. These deal with issues relating to the Israelite kings who reigned in Jerusalem during the period of the monarchy. And an example of that would be Psalm chapter 2, a very well-known psalm. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, Let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, I have set my king on Mount Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give the nations as your heritage, and the ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So again, the context here is this royal situation, right? So a lot of these psalms were written perhaps by the kings, or they were written about the kings. And then we have psalms that are written about creation, and these celebrate God's creation of the world and sometimes the special place that human beings have within this world. Psalm chapter 8 is a good example of this. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have established, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? And then we've got wisdom psalms. These provide instruction in right living and right faith in the tradition of the other wisdom writings of the Old Testament, such as Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. In most of these psalms, the path of wisdom is understood in terms of obedience to God's law. An example of a wisdom psalm would be Psalm chapter 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. And on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. And then lastly, we've got the enthronement psalms, and these celebrate the enthronement of the Lord as king in the midst of the people of God. So it's not the enthronement of the Israelite monarch or the Judahite monarch, but it's the enthronement of God. So we see this in Psalm 99. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim, let the earth quake. The Lord is great in Zion. He is exalted over all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he, the King in his might, loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Right, so that's what we call form criticism of the Psalms. You're trying to identify these forms, these structures. You're trying to come up with ways to categorize them in order to interpret them and understand the situation in life within which these Psalms were written. One criticism of the form critical approach is that the supposed features of a given form are rarely all present within the psalm. Okay, so think of that analogy I made earlier with the chair. Okay, so we've identified something as a chair, but it doesn't have any legs, it doesn't have any back, it doesn't have any arm rests, and yet people will call that a chair. Is that really a chair, though? Or what if we've got something with 4 legs, like a chair, and a seat, but no arms and no back? Is that a chair? Or something with just a seat and no back and no arms and just a single leg? Would that qualify as a chair? Maybe we should call it something else, like a stool. Or maybe we've got a hymn that doesn't have the introduction, or it doesn't have the narrative section, or it doesn't have the conclusion, and for some reason we still call it a hymn. Or sometimes we've got a blending of these different forms. And so, like, let's say we have a lament psalm that contains many of the elements that we find in individual praise, like a hymn of praise. I think Psalm 22 starts off as like a lament, and then it ends in praise to God. So how do you categorize that psalm? Because it's got the characteristics of both a hymn of praise and a lament. And so the question arises as to whether we can legitimately categorize these psalms according to some ideal form if they don't really match that ideal form. Well, another way to categorize the psalms is by grouping them into different collections. So we've got hymns, and a lot of these are going to be grouped according to the superscriptions, where a lot of times you'll see like a Psalm of David, right? So those will be grouped into the Davidic collections, or the Korahite collection of psalms, where you've got the name Korah in the superscription. And then we've got the Elohist collection, which is an interesting group of psalms where the name Yahweh, or the tetragram, Yod He Vav He, doesn't occur, or at least it doesn't occur quite as often as we would expect. Instead, the title Elohim is used. And so it seems as if some later scribe has gone through and systematically eliminated any references to Yahweh and replaced them with the word Elohim. The Elohistic collection is contained in chapters 42 through 83, and we've got the Psalms of Asaph and so on. So you can kind of look through some of these here. All right, and then let me say a little something about authorship. For most of the Psalms, like most of the books of the Old Testament, the authors are simply unknown. David, however, was remembered as a prolific psalmist, and 73 of the 150 Psalms are thought to be attributed to David in their superscriptions. Others are attributed to Moses, Ethan, Korah, Asaph, and Solomon. And so notice this quote from the Qumran Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls. "And David, son of Jesse, was wise and brilliant like the light of the sun, and a scribe, and discerning and perfect in all his ways before God and humans. And Yahweh gave him a discerning and enlightened spirit. And he wrote 3,600 psalms. And he wrote 364 songs to sing before the altar over the perpetual holocaust for every day, for all the days of the year." The perpetual holocaust was a type of sacrifice that was offered. It was a sacrifice where you burn the entire animal. And 52 songs for the Sabbath offerings, and 30 songs for the new moons, for all the festival days, and for the Day of Atonement. So the total of all the songs which he uttered were 446. And he also wrote 4 songs for making music over those possessed by evil spirits. Interesting comment there. So the complete total was 4,050. All these he uttered through prophecy, which had been given to him from before the Most High. Okay, so David is considered to be the author of these psalms, and he's also thought to have been inspired, and so to have worked as a prophet when he composed these psalms. And so there's a recognition here that these psalms are actually scripture and not just some purely human compositions. Okay, so that's the Dead Sea Scrolls, but then we've got another tradition in the Midrash Tehillim. Tehillim is just the Hebrew word for psalms. So this is the Midrash on the Psalms. I'm not really sure what the date is on this. Parts of this Midrash go back to the Talmudic period, so like the 500s, and then and then later redactions were made in the 7th through the 8th and 9th centuries, and then some even later than that. So it's a very complex composition that is not easy to date. But let's hear what it has to say. A parable tells us, "There was a company of musicians that sought to sing a hymn to the king. The king said to them, 'To be sure, all of you are sweet singers, all of you are musicians, all of you have superior skill, all of you are men worthy of taking part in the singing of the hymn to the king. Yet let the hymn in whose singing all of you will take part bear the name of only one man among you, because his voice is the sweetest of all your voices. Thus it is written, the saying of David the son of Jesse, the sweet singer of the Psalms of Israel.'" So here it's recognized that David was, you might say, the author, but not really, because it's other people who are writing who have the same skill set as he did, but they're writing in his name. So it's not really David, it's kind of people writing in the tradition of David. All right, well, despite the tradition of Davidic authorship for nearly half of the Psalms, it seems unlikely that he wrote many of these. He may have written some, but probably most of them were not written by David. And the other names that are attributed to the Psalms are also disputed by commentators. Okay, but you might say, well, what about the superscriptions to these Psalms? I mean, they clearly say a Psalm of David or a Psalm of Asaph or whatever. Well, yeah, but the superscriptions were probably written at a later time than when the Psalms themselves were composed. And we can kind of discern this when we compare, for example, the superscriptions in the Masoretic text over against the Septuagint, because they're not always the same. You can compare the superscriptions in Psalm 22 and 43, for example. And then another issue that's not always appreciated is the ambiguity of some of these superscriptions. For example, the Psalms of David, in Hebrew, it says, Mizmor le David. Now, you could translate that as a psalm of David, as if he was the author, or you could translate it as a psalm for David, or a psalm to David, or a psalm written at the direction of David. So there's a difficulty in trying to interpret these superscriptions, and so they don't necessarily claim to have been written by David or Asaph or whoever. And then the last thing I want to mention is the dating. So we don't know who the authors are of these psalms. And so because of that, it's often difficult to assign a date to any particular psalm. If we want to do that, we have to look at other things like the internal evidence. So we look at, possible historical references, such as the anointing of a king, the destruction of Jerusalem, the Babylonian exile, and so on. Or we can look to thematic concerns, which might fit into the life of David, such as, Psalm 51 or chapter 41, verse 9. Or we could look at the vocabulary and grammar, and we can try to surmise when the psalm would have been written based on what we know about the development of the Hebrew language. But these are all very difficult ways to assign dates. And a lot of times what you end up with in the commentaries is the commentator will say this was probably written during the exilic period or the pre-exilic period, the monarchical period, which is pretty much the same thing as pre-exilic, the exilic period, or maybe even the Persian period or the Greek period. So in other words, just very general dates. And a lot of times commentators will disagree. Some people will say, for example, that Psalm 82 was written in the Greek period. Other people will say, no, it's actually pre-exilic, monarchical period. So it's kind of funny, there's so much disagreement about these things. And yet, people are very dogmatic about what they think about, like when this psalm was written, who wrote it, or, what the circumstances were and all that sort of thing. All right, so that's all I have to say about the book of Psalms. I know it's a little basic, but we've covered a lot of ground, and I hope it was helpful. By the way, for this presentation, I've relied very heavily on this book by De Clacy Walford. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. And so not much of what I've said is original with me, but actually very little is original in Walford's book either. Most of this stuff you'll find in any introduction to the Psalms. I just happen to like how Walford presents the material. I think she does a really good job in laying it out, and it's very easy to read and all that sort of thing. So I recommend getting this book if you want to study this stuff a little bit further, or in case you're looking for an introductory book for one of your own classes or Bible studies or something.